Serial killers lurk amongst us as everyday people. Your postman, church leaders, your next-door neighbor, or even your significant other. Here at Real 10 we are going over the 10 serial killers in the United States. Number 10. Gary Ridgway. He became known as the Green River Killer and later was known as the deadliest convicted serial killer. He claims to have killed over 80 women in Washington in the 1980s and 90s. Gary Ridgway was first arrested in 1980 after choking prostitute, but never charged with anything. In 1982 Ridgway was convicted of solicitation of a prostitute, and many experts believed that this is when his killing spree began. His first believed victim was said to be a 16-year-old girl, whose body was found in the Green River. Over the next few years Ridgway raped and murdered over 40 women, the majority of them being sex workers. In the next 2 years, Ridgway raped and killed over 40 women, many of whom were sex workers. His last murder occurred in 1998. He was finally arrested in 2001 when he confessed to wanting to kill prostitutes, and in 2003, he was given a plea deal and was sentenced to 48 life sentences, though he said he killed more than 80 women. Number 9. Dean Candyman Corll. The Candyman made a name for himself from 1970 to 1973. Corll killed at least 28 young boys and was identified to be behind the Houston mass murders. Corll used 2 teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, to lure young boys to his apartment, where they were shackled, sexually assaulted, and killed. In 1973, the Candyman was shot several times by Henley, and when talking to the police Henley confessed everything. He brought law enforcement to the mass graves around Houston. According to reports, some of the bodies had been mutilated, others were buried with tape around their mouths or cords around their necks. Number 8. Bertha Gunners. Known as Hell's Belle, is unlike the other killers on this list. Gunners is said to have killed at least 14 people, but some believe she may have had up to 40 victims. Gunners moved from Chicago to a pig farm in Indiana. She reportedly murdered her 2 husbands and collected the life insurance money, and later, her foster daughter's body would be found with several other dismembered corpses buried in her hog pen. She would advertise for wealthy, single men to invest in her farm, and nearly all of them went missing shortly after arriving. In 1908, her house burned down and her 3 children's bodies were found inside the burned house. They also reportedly found the headless body of a woman in the house. This was believed to be Gunners, but folklore say she got away. Ray Lamphere, a handyman, was arrested and charged with the arson of her house after the pair had a falling out, and Lamphere confessed that he helped Gunners kill 42 people and bury them in the pig pen. Number 7. Richard Cottingham. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the Torso Killer left a trail of brutal murders in New York City. For several months, women, mostly prostitutes, were found in hotel rooms, their bodies mutilated. He was given the name Torso Killer because he often cut off his victims' heads and hands. This left the victims almost impossible to identify. Finally caught in 1984, Cottingham was found guilty of 5 murders and sentenced to 200 years in prison and has since confessed to many more. Some believe around 80 to 100 victims met their end from him. In April 2021, Cottingham confessed to drowning 2 girls in New Jersey in 1974. He currently is 75 years old, serving his sentence in the New Jersey State Prison, where he will rot until his own death. Number 6. David Berkowitz. The son of Sam brought fear and terror to New York City in 1976 and 1977 and was the cause of one of the largest manhunts in NYC history. Berkowitz wrote in his diary that he set around 1,500 fires in New York City in the mid-1970s and claimed to be driven by demons. He killed a total of 6 victims and injured more. He enjoyed targeting couples. He also wrote letters to newspapers, signing them Son of Sam. This was a black Labrador retriever owned by his neighbor. David felt a demon lived inside of this dog. He was arrested in 1977, just 11 days after his last murder, and confessed to the killings. Berkowitz is currently serving a sentence of 365 years in a New York prison. Number 5. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, was a notorious killer and sex offender who killed and dismembered 17 boys and young men between 1978 to 1991. Dahmer was arrested in 1991 after a man named Tracy Edwards was found by police running down the street in handcuffs, having narrowly escaped Dahmer's clutches. Police later went to Dahmer's apartment, where they found photo albums of dismembered bodies, human heads in the refrigerator and freezer, several skulls, and a 57-gallon drum filled with acid and decomposing bodies inside. Dahmer's victims all fit the same criteria: Black, Asian, and Latino. He confessed to 17 murders total and was sentenced to 15 life terms. Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate. Many of the inmates felt sickened by his presence. Number 4. Samuel Little. He was known as one of the most prolific killers in American history. Having gone undetected for decades, Little confessed to killing 93 victims in 19 states between 1970 and 2005. Law enforcement had been able to verify 50 of the confessions. Most of his victims were young black women. In 2012, Little was arrested at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, on a narcotics charge and was extradited to California, where police in Los Angeles were able to convict him for killing 3 women in the late 1980s after being linked through DNA evidence found at the crime scenes. All of these women had been beaten, then strangled, their bodies dumped in an alley, or a dumpster. He had been serving a life sentence at a state prison in Los Angeles County when he died in 2020 at the age of 80. Number 3. John Wayne Gacy. Known as Pogo the Clown, he was responsible for the deaths of at least 33 boys and young men in Chicago in the 1970s. Gacy was arrested several times for sexual assaults in the 60s, the first being a teenage boy. After being released on parole in the early 1970s, Gacy was able to purchase a home in a Chicago suburb, from which neighbors later recalled a horrible stench emanating. In 1978, 15-year-old boy went missing, and police discovered that Gacy had been the last to have seen him. Upon further investigation by law enforcement, they uncovered the bodies of 29 boys and young men in or near Gacy's house and 4 more near Des Plaines River. He pleaded innocent by reason of insanity, but the jury rejected this evaluation, and Gacy was found guilty of all 33 murders. He was executed by lethal injection in 1994. Number 2. Ted Bundy. Having been described as intelligent and charming, Bundy used his good looks to lure his victims in, sexually assaulting and killing at least 36 women across Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Florida between 1974 and 1978. Some have estimated he could be responsible for hundreds of deaths. Bundy was sentenced to death in 1979 for the murder of 2 college students and again for the rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl. He was executed in Florida by electric chair in 1989. And finally, number 1. Dennis Rader. BTK was a serial killer in Kansas who murdered 10 people over the span of 3 decades. He nicknamed himself BTK because he bound, tortured, and killed his victims. His first murders were 1974 when he strangled 4 family members, including 2 children. He is known for hiding in plain sight, president of a church congregation and a loving husband and father. Like a lot of these killers, he wanted attention for his crimes, and in 1977, BTK wrote a letter to a local TV station that read, "How many people do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" He was arrested in 2005 after sending a disc to the police department. Law enforcement was able to trace back to the church where he confessed to stalkings and killings, as well as sexual fantasies that drove his crimes. The BTK killer was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison in Kansas. There you have it. 10 serial killers from the United States. Very eerie, all of them hid in plain sight. So how well do you know your neighbor, pastor, grocer, or even your own family? Stay tuned for part 2 where we will travel through history and dive in deeper. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel.